John chapter 1, verses 35 to 42. The word that we'll be featuring in this section is number 287, Lamb. The title is Two Disciples Follow Jesus. And in this section, we're going to highlight the proper names, which are nouns, in red. It begins in verse 35, Ti epavrion, Paulin istiki o Ioannis. The next day again, John stood. So it's going back up to John the immerser. Kx ton mathi ton af tu theo, and from out of his disciples two. So there was John with two of his followers, just as Jesus had disciples. The same word, mathi ton, mathematics comes from that. Someone that's learning. So they were there. It says, Ke emvlipsos to Ioannou peripatunti, and looking at Jesus walking. So Jesus was someplace close to where John was immersing on the Jordan, and they see Jesus. Now, it mentions in Luke the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth and having John the baby and then Mary visiting her before she delivered. You would think that they grew up together and they would know each other very well, but apparently that's not the case from everything else you read, and especially here in John. So, but yet he sees them walking, and he says, Ide o amnos tu theou, behold the Lamb of God. Now, how he knew Jesus was the Messiah that was the coming one, we're not really told. We're left in the dark on that. But other places, it's almost like he didn't know Jesus that well. Maybe knew of him. So, but he says, behold the Lamb of God. Now, that's a strange word to place on a person, the Lamb of God. And we see the lambs in the Old Testament as offerings, animals to be sacrificed, to be slain, and for different liturgical purposes of the temple or the tabernacle. We see lambs for a yield offering, 2 lambs of a year old in Leviticus 9:3. Lambs for a whole burnt offering of a year old, unblemished. And Leviticus 14:12 has a lamb for the trespass offering, and then further down in the same verse for a sin offering, and then a sacrifice of deliverance offering, Leviticus 23:19, and an increase offering, Leviticus 23:20. So the lamb was an animal that was going to be slain. I believe this is what John is seeing, the Lamb of God that's going to be slain. That's my opinion. It says in Isaiah 16:1, a strange verse, I will send a male lamb lording over the land. Now, it's not quite sure there if it's talking about Moab or Israel, but a male lamb. And then in Isaiah 53:7, it says, and as a lamb before the one shearing is voiceless, so he opened not his mouth. And we know that's a quotation used in the New Testament for Jesus. So John, I believe, sees Jesus as a lamb slain for an offering. 1 Peter 1:19, it says, but by the esteemed blood, parentheses, as a lamb unblemished and spotless of Christ. And this is the lamb that was unblemished, and that was spotless, and that was Jesus Christ, who was sinless, who died for us, and for us to be risen up with him as he was. In verse 37, it continues, Ke ikuson afto e theo mathite laluntos, and the 2 disciples heard him speaking. So that's the Lamb of God. Ke ikoluthisan to Isu, and they followed Jesus. something that John said that sparked their attention enough that they would leave him and then go and find out what John was talking about. In verse 38, Straphiste o Isus, and Jesus, Isus, having turned. Now this is the names in the red. So we had Jesus. Here are all three places, and then John, Ioannis, at the beginning. So Jesus now turns ke theasamenos avtus akoluthuntas, and viewing, he sees them following. So he looks back, Elegi avtis, and he says to them, Ti zitite, what do you seek? Ide ipen avto, and they said to him, Ravi, o legate erimenavomenon didaskale, which is to say, being translated, pu menis, where do you remain or where do you stay? For some reason, they wanted to know a little bit about him, and I suppose that's the first thing they ask him, where are you going, where do you live, and so forth. The word Ravi appears on the New Testament only, rabbi, and 17 times it is used in the New Testament. But Matthew 23:8, it says, but you should not be called rabbi, for one is your mentor, the Christ. So we don't call anybody a rabbi if we're Christians. The Jews still do, Rebbe, so-and-so. And it says in Matthew 14:45 that Judas called him rabbi when he delivered him up to the soldiers at the garden. Peter calls him a rabbi in Mark 9:5. Nicodemus, when he visited Jesus at night, called him rabbi. That was in John 3:2. And John the Immerser called him rabbi in John 3:26, which we'll get to. The disciples call him rabbi, John 4:31, John 9:2, and John 11:8. And the people following, seeing Jesus, called him a rabbi also, John 6:25. It's interesting how so many of these people call him a rabbi. Now in Israel today, there are still rabbis. There was one famous Rabbi Mendelssohn, who they thought was the Messiah. The Jews followed these rabbis, but they wouldn't follow the true rabbi, which was Jesus Christ. They followed the false rabbis who are telling them all sorts of things that are wrong. They're going along with it down the path of destruction even today. In verse 39, then it continues, Legi avtis, erkase ke idete, come and see, says to them. And ilthon ke idon pu meni, and they came and saw where he stayed, ke par avto, eminon tin imeron akinin, and they stayed with him that day. Now, other places mentions that the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. He doesn't own any particular property, is what I gather is what he's talking about. He had places to stay, but no place that was permanent. This place was probably some place that he rented or was allowed to use in some way. And it says, Ora de in os dekatin, and the hour was about the 10th. So a little bit later than when Jesus was crucified by the 9th hour. Verse 40, in Andreas, and there's another name, O Adelphos Simonos Petru, the brother of Simon Peter. And there's two more names. Es ek ton theo ton akusanton para Ioannou. And it was Andrew and the brother of Simon Peter, one from out of the two of the ones having heard from John. So apparently Andrew was a disciple of John first, and then he became a disciple of Jesus. And he is the brother of Simon Peter, and then he heard from John the Immerser. Ke akoluthisan ton avto, and having followed him, and evriski autos protos ton adelphon ton idion Simona, and he finds first his own brother Simon, that would be later renamed Peter. Ke legi avto, and he says to him, Evri kaman ton Messian, we found the Messiah. And the word Messian says in parentheses, which is OSD metherminevomenon Christos, which is being translated Christ. Now, we went to the word Christ, the anointed one, I think in the last few sections, someplace there. But now we have a new word, a Messiah. I believe in Hebrews today they call him the Mashiach, but it's Messian in the Greek. And we see in John 4:25, with Jesus in Samaria, the woman says to him, I know that Messiah comes, the one being called Christ. And then Jesus says that he is the one. So I think that's the only other place that the word Messiah appears in the New Testament. In verse 42, Ke igagan avton proston soon, and he, Andrew, led his brother Simon to Jesus. Ke emvlepsas they avto o Isus ipe, and Jesus, looking at him, said, Si Simon, o Ios Iona, you are Simon, the son of Jonah. Simon Bar Jonah was his name. You shall be called Kephas, Cephas, which is translated, it says, O Erimenevite Petros, a piece of rock. Well, it's going to be called Peter, but Petros here is not the name. It's what the word means, what Kephas means. And Kephas is number 2786. But we don't number the names in the Apostolic Bible because it's too confusing with the Old and the New Testament. But the word Kephas is mentioned 1 Corinthians 1:12, 3:22, and 9:5, 15:5, and Galatians 2:9. All these places are the disciples and Paul talking about Peter, who is called Kephas. You shall be called Kephas. Now, then Petros, Peter, is this word here, which is translated a piece of rock. It gets kind of confusing because you don't see the usage of Kephas very much, but you do Petros. But Petros here, like I said, means a piece of rock. And later we'll get to that place where Jesus talks about building his assembly upon the rock, but it's a different size rock. This is a piece of rock, and it says in 2 Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, which I never really dealt with, but I found that it says, in opening a privy door of the roof, they threw stones like thunderbolts. So it's a small stone that they could throw. And then again in Maccabees 4:41, some of them caught or grabbed stones, some clubs, and others taking handfuls of dust. So it wasn't a giant rock. There was something that they could throw at people. I mean, who knows what size, but they were small enough for a hand to grasp them and to throw them. So Kephas, who is now going to be called Peter in more places than any, it means a piece of rock. Our next section is Philip and Nathanael. Very interesting section.